Hey, this is Jake from Minimal Audio, and today I want to talk to you guys about our new Rift update, Rift 2.1.0. So it's been a little bit since we updated Rift, and we added mostly just various enhancements, improvements, optimizations to graphics, optimizations to the DSP. We found a couple of places things were clicking during weird loop positions and stuff like that. So pretty minor stuff. But there is one major update in Rift 2.1.0, and that is the update to the modulation system. So it begs the question, why even touch the modulation system at all? So if you already use Rift, you know that the modulation system in Rift is this really nice flow where you have color coding on each of the individual mod sources, and you can see all of the modulators on the entire app at all times. And that works really well for Rift because there's only 4 modulators. But we needed to change that because we're building bigger stuff at Minimal Audio all the time. And although you guys haven't seen it yet, we've been working on our flagship synthesizer, and it is awesome. I've been producing music and building plugins for over 10 years, and this synth is what I've wanted to build since actually I started programming. It was something I wanted to do since before I even coded. So actually this whole journey of being a music producer and then learning how to code and then working at these music tech companies and then eventually getting my buddies and founding Minimal Audio, the whole journey of the past 10 years has been really to create this product. So that's super exciting. But the thing is, with the new synth, it has 35 modulators or something inside of it. So we can't possibly show all of them all the time everywhere. And another important ethos for us at Minimal Audio is that we want continuity between our products. And we want there to be very little friction moving from one product to another product. So we want all the modulation system to work the same across everything. We want a very unified design style. And we want that when we improve one product, all of the products improve. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what was kind of annoying with Rift's modulation system, what could we improve about it, and we made a variety of enhancements that we believe make it, easier, faster to work with, easier to understand, and also allows us to support what's coming in that larger product, that synthesizer, having as many modulators as we want active at the same time. So with that said, let's jump into Ableton and I'll show you guys what has changed. Cool, so here we are, and here's today's loop for, experimenting. Cool, so we got a little bit of a 130 garage track happening, and I'm gonna open up Rift and let's take a look at what is new. So everything basically the same, except for if you are coming from a previous version of Rift, you'll notice that these used to all be different colors. And now what we have is there are 4 modulators in here, and I guess technically there's 6 actually because we have the 2 macro knobs down here which count. And the way it works now is you always have a selected modulator, right? So whichever tab I have open is going to be the selected modulator. Likewise, if macro 1 is assigned to something, if I'm hovering macro 1, that's going to become the selected modulator. So let's go through and assign some modulation and see what this new workflow looks like. So let's say I want to attach this LFO to the cutoff over here. So I drag LFO to cutoff, same flow as always, drag up the modulation amount, and then we have the filter cutoff modulating. Well, that's great. So let's say we want to do another set of modulation. Let's say we want to modulate the positive shape by the curve. So I can select the curve. You can see now the curve is selected. The modulation is still applied to the filter, but now it's become purple. And that's because it's made room for the curve to be the selected modulator. So we'll go ahead and put the modulation amount up at 100% on the curve. And that's pretty much it. So if I select curve 1, I see curve 1's destinations. And if I select LFO, I see the LFO's destinations. And that works all over. So I've gone ahead and just applied modulation all over the place. And so we can see as we're working with the modulators, the modulation that we're focused on is what is highlighted across the entire app. So if I select curve 1, then I can see all the things that curve 1 is affecting, and then I can go ahead and just focus on that modulator. So now say we have more than one modulation source connected to a destination. So we have curve 1 assigned to positive shape. Let's say we assign curve 2 also to positive shape. So now you see we have 2 indicators around the knob, and just like selecting the modulator at the source changes what's highlighted, you can also hover over the individual sliders around the knob to see what modulator that is. So I can hover over this modulation depth slider here and see that curve 1 is this modulation depth slider. And if I hover over this modulation depth slider, I can see that curve 2 is this modulation depth slider. And if I select curve 2, then that globally becomes selected. Cool, so if you remember from the previous version of Rift, basically as you added more modulators here, the rings expanded and you saw more rings around the knob. So that has been the biggest change. So I'll go ahead and reset that. I'm going to just go ahead and load the default patch again. And I want to talk a little bit about the modulation depth, which has changed a little bit. So something you may not be aware of in Rift is that you are allowed to modulate the depths of modulators. So you can think about modulation inside minimal audio products as having two layers. There's the first layer, which is the regular modulation, which, you know, most producers are accustomed to. And then there's the second layer, which is the depth modulation, which allows you to use another modulator to control how much modulation amount is there from the first modulator. So let me just show you that example really quickly because it can seem a little bit complicated, but then, you know, be pretty simple in practice. So back over to Rift, and if I assign curve 2 now to positive shape, right? Now we have a full range modulation, a full range LFO going from 0 to 100% on this knob. Now, let's say we want to control how much modulation range was here. So sometimes we wanted to modulate around like 10% or whatever, and then sometimes all the way to 100%. So you assign depth modulation by taking a source and dropping it onto the depth slider of another source, right? And you can see that changes the state here. We now have 2 rings. And that indicates that there's a depth modulation applied to this modulator. So when I dropped that macro 1 depth modulation onto curve 2, what happened was macro 1 now took control of the range of the modulation, right? So when macro 1 is at 0%, there's no modulation. And when macro 2 is at 100%, there's 100% modulation. So this goes actually even a little bit deeper because you can change the starting point here. So say I'm dragging this amount with depth modulation, I'm affecting the depth modulation amount. So this ring is showing me when the macro 1 is at 100%, here is where the modulation amount is going to end. So if I hold shift, you'll see there's a little highlight change that happens on the knob. And that means now I'm adjusting the start value of the modulation. So if I go ahead and I drag this down, right? Now we can do this interesting thing where I can say, okay, when the macro 1 is at 0%, I want this much modulation. And when macro 1's at 100%, I want no modulation. And you can position this wherever you want, right? So you can do a unipolar modulation around the center of the knob, and you can actually set this to bipolar and do bipolar depth modulation. You'll see this technique used in a bunch of minimal audio presets. So I'll just open up one, and so you can see we have data here, which is controlling the depth on a lot of these feedback parameters and the delay. So if I turn data down, all the modulation happening in the feedback goes away. And then if I turn data up, cool. So I hope that gives you a good overview of the changes we've made to the Rift modulation system and why we've done them. Although depth modulation is mostly used by preset designers to make very powerful macro knobs, it can also be indispensable in the right circumstances when you're making your track. That's it for me. Have a good one.